just, I see Mr. Anderson. So I bet you will see Councilor Pena soon as well.
We will.
And Madam Chair, we are live. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. So we will call to order the December 4th meeting of the City of Albuquerque Intergovernmental Legislative Relations Committee. And I understand we have a quorum. We have looks like a quick agenda in front of us. So let's get started. We'll start with a report from our state lobbyists, Mr. Thompson and Mr. Park. I'm not sure which one of you is planning to go first. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and hi, everybody. Not a lot to report.
This meeting is being recorded.
With the exception of, we're in the middle of a huge transition with the new legislature. So today I spent the day in Santa Fe for they're part of doing the new member orientation. They're doing some ethics training, etc. And there are rumors abounding as it relates to capital outlay. And so like today, there was talk of there being a reversion bill. Last year, Chairman Munoz said he wasn't going to do reauthorizations. So there was rumors of a reversion bill, which would basically be where some collection of capital projects that are going to need to be reauthorized or repurposed would be swept. I don't know that that is going to happen or could happen, but it's that time of the season when you start to hear those kinds of rumors. And my inclination is not so much to report them so that we worry about them, but just more as a reminder that with a new legislature and a governor at the end of their term, it's extremely important that we pay attention and also that we're agile and ready to respond to questions from folks. And the one thing that I know from the city of Albuquerque is that we have the professional staff to be able to respond to stuff. So I'm not terribly worried by it, but there are those types of rumors out there.
Hey, Joe, can I jump in on that real quick? I don't want to take your thing, but I was at the LFC before Thanksgiving, and I think those rumors were, Chairman Munoz at the LFC specifically talked about doing a sweep of money that had not been that had been appropriated but not expended, that was sitting there for over 5 years. He thinks that's close to $400 million. So it's not going to be quite that arbitrary and bright in the way they do it. But I had dinner with him after the LSC one night, and I asked him, I said, "Are you really going to do it this year, or are you going to wait?" And he seemed to indicate that he was in a hurry to get it done because people have had time to do it. Thankfully, I think, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but the city's pretty good about spending their money. But if there's other entities or other groups, I think it's going to be a serious push that this might happen in this upcoming 60-day session. That's all I wanted to add. Thanks, Joe.
Yeah, sure. And then the other thing would be more of a Mr. Park question. But another thing that was talked about was it's a new legislature. So we are going to expect to see every crummy bill we've ever seen in the past, along with a whole new batch of crummy bills. And where we see that type of stuff that as it relates to the city of Albuquerque is typically in our relationship with the county. So extraterritorial zoning, those types of issues where it puts us at conflict with the county. I haven't heard anything specific, but it's something that I think collectively our leadership from the mayor's office as well as the council, we need to all be on the same page that when we start to see threats to our autonomy manifest, that we have a way of dealing with them. In years past during 60-day sessions, we tried to have those meetings. They would be on Saturdays. I have no recommendation on that. I'll leave that up to everyone. But just depending on what is introduced, I do think that we need to be able to be responsive quickly. And what I would typically do is with Mr. Park, we would just be reporting that stuff upstairs. And then folks would say, we want more information on X, Y, or Z. The other thing I would say is, the governor and the legislature aren't on the best terms. And so there's typically sometimes things that could happen there where we could be caught in the middle. And so it's just stuff that nothing specific, but just things we need to be mindful of going forward. And Mr. Park, perhaps you have more.
Yeah, I just want to. I think Joe, I just want to segue just a hair on that, which is, this is the governor's final 60-day session. In addition, we've just done an election where you now have new members of both the House and the Senate. Now, many of the former House members have moved to the Senate, but before we got into the meeting, I went up to the freshman orientation on Monday, and there's a lot of new legislators. They have a lot of ideas. They are extremely enthusiastic. They're excited to come and do it. And I think that Mr. Thompson is correct, which is we're probably going to see a lot of legislation right out of the gates on stuff. And I think, the key is we're just going to have to wade through it and see where they're going. The other thing I'll say that I've started to notice is all the legislators now have legislative assistants. And it has not taken legislators very long to try to push off some of their meetings and their work and some of their policy meetings to their legislative assistants. Whereas before, we would just call or text and go see the legislators. Now they're trying to figure out, and every legislator is different. Some still use them in different ways, but it's really interesting that some of them are really trying to push us to incorporate meetings with their legislative assistants and see how that relationship sort of, I think, evolves going forward into the future. Joe, have you had that experience?
Very much so. And it's really weird because all these folks are the legislators that are going to have these staffers, most of whom were staffers at the Capitol last year during the session. One of the rules is if you're an in-district staffer, you can't be at the Capitol. So it's going to be very, very weird this first year.
Right. And that's hard for some of the legislators, because I know some of the legislators want to use their district staffers for in-session staff. So we'll see. But I think ultimately we're well positioned coming into the 60-day session. I think Joe is right. There's definitely, I think, some leftover tension from the failed special session between the legislature and the governor. That's not an us issue. That's a them issue. It's sort of like when you have two siblings fighting. I'm trying not to get in the middle of it because we're going to work with anyone who will work with us. And I think we've done a really good job of maintaining relationships at all levels across the legislative process.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson and Mr. Park. Anybody have any questions for our state lobbyists? Yes, Councilor Bassan.
Madam Chair, what are the dates of the session?
It is the third Tuesday in January, which is what, the 18th?
January 21 through 60 days later.
And Madam Chair, somebody was saying that something might happen even earlier than that. Is that anything that you've heard rumored?
Well, Madam Chair and Councilor Bassan, what will happen is the Legislative Finance Committee does meet and they start cooking the budget, about 2 weeks before, because the session starts so late. So right after the beginning of the year, they will be meeting to assemble the budget. So yes, the LFC will be meeting, but that's really about it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's correct. And Councilor Bassan, I'll tell you, just from a historical perspective, it used to be that the LFC would only meet the week before the session in 30-day sessions because they had such a truncated period of time. But now we're starting to see them do it every session regardless. So it's just, I think it's for those who watch the legislature, it's part of their evolution towards almost a full-time legislature at this point. And it's just a further expansion. So it'll be interesting to see, because I think Joe's right, because it does start on the 21st, which is a little bit later than usual. So I think, Joe, are they going in on the 13th? I think they're starting, LFC is supposed to start on the 13th. But there will be people up in Santa Fe the week of the 6th too. So it's going to be a bit of a shotgun start. the key is to remember it's a marathon, not a sprint.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Thompson or Mr. Park? Thank you, gentlemen, for the update. I know that we have obviously been paying close attention as well to the discussion related to the reversions. And, yeah, I think the city is sitting in a very good position in terms of our capacity and capabilities in this space and ensuring that we're being responsible with spending the dollars that have been appropriated from the state. So thank you. Next on the agenda is a report from our federal lobbyist, Mr. O'Donnell. I see you there, so thank you for being here. I think you're on mute, Mr. O'Donnell.
Yes, good afternoon and thank you. Let me start by saying one thing about where we are with the FY25 appropriations. As you've probably heard, it looks like what Congress will do is a short-term continuing resolution into next year, and I think it will probably go as far as March. The current one expires on December 20th. So the majority in both the House and the Senate, it's in their interest to extend this FY25 appropriations process into next year and maybe make some changes to it. One of the things that your state lobbyist said was that what we're hearing is a lot of possibilities of what they might do with the FY25 budget and what they might do with the FY26 spending bills for federal agencies. A lot of that is speculation. I think there's probably, it's wise to think in terms of the White House and Congress probably cutting back on some spending for programs. By how much, I don't know, but a lot of programs are written into law, and formula programs are very difficult to change. And I read someplace last week where both Medicare, Medicaid, some of that spending accounts for about at least half of the federal budget. It might be 2/3 of required mandatory spending. So the discretionary spending is the one that really becomes the target for funding reductions. And as I would not have expected this, but as I've heard earlier this year, and it's been talked about since the election, there are talks from some Republicans about cutting the defense budget. So we'll see how that plays out in early 2025. I thought I would also include that the House now, the number of Republicans is at 220. The number of Democrats is at 215. The last race, I think they decided yesterday, it was a California race where a Republican incumbent lost to a Democratic challenger. In the Senate, the Republican split is going to be 53 Republicans and 47 Democrats. What that means most immediately for the New Mexico delegation is our two senators are now in the minority. So they'll be ranking members of committees where they were chair. That remains to be seen if Senator Heinrich will stay as the ranking member of the appropriations, the Ag Appropriations Committee. And Senator Lujan was chair of the Media Broadband Subcommittee in the Senate, so he would become ranking and on that committee. I haven't heard any rumors about committee changes by the senators. The only one committee change that has been made public is that Congressman Ledger Fernandez is seeking an appropriations seat. New Mexico, over time, has usually had a senator on appropriations and a member of the House delegation on appropriations. But I think the last House member to serve on appropriations was Joe Skeen, and he retired back in 2003. So she's made it known that she wants to be on the subcommittee. So we'll see how that turns out. They do these assignments in an interesting way. And I think New Mexico may get tied in with Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, and California. And there's a way that they give certain regions of the country X number of appropriations members. And it's not always every state. It depends on how they float that number around within the region. So we'll see how that turns out. That will be something that probably be decided before the start of this next Congress, which is January 3rd, but we'll see how that plays out for her. That's all I have to report. Oh, I should say, yes, the other major pieces of legislation, the National Defense Authorization Act, the Water Resources Development Act, of course, the CR or appropriations, and the Farm Bill. And right now, they're going to finish the National Defense Authorization Act. That's a certainty. The Water Resources Development Act was finished yesterday by the House and the Senate. So that bill will be signed by the president. That bill has some impacts on New Mexico. I won't get into those discussions right now, but they do play a part in stormwater management, flood control, and in that bill, they've also they included the authorization for the Economic Development Administration. So that legislation is impactful for a lot of local governments. Madam Chair, that's the end of my legislative report.
Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. Are there any questions for Mr. O'Donnell? Great, thank you very much for your thorough report. Appreciate that. The next item on our agenda is for us to discuss the administration and city council federal legislative programs. I think Mr. Parkinson and Mr. Minicucci are prepared to walk us through these two items. I think our goal today is that we would, as a committee, be looking to send these to council without rec for their council's consideration, for note of receipt for the administration as well. And so want to make sure that we are able to talk through these to a level that we all feel like we would, whether we have amendments or edits, to make sure that we can hopefully get there. So who's up first? Mr. Parkinson.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, councilors and members. Looks like ours is already up here being shared. So I just wanted to, briefly kind of discuss how it was put together. Of course, with the ordinance update and changes and whatnot, I had to keep playing by ear on how we were going to do it on our end. But we collected some projects and ideas and things from all different departments, and decided to put them in to a similar format to our other state capital layout. And it's being a former congressional staffer myself, I know giving long documents doesn't always seem to get thoroughly analyzed. So we wanted to keep it at least broad enough so we mention our projects and have some details in there as well to give a good idea of what we're going to be going after, whether it be grants, earmarks, policy, etc. So with that, that's really all I had to add into it. It's just 2 pages, should be a easy read, and I stand for any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Parkinson. I don't know if there are any questions, or should we go on to Mr. Mancucci and then we can talk about the collection of the two in total? Would you like to go ahead, Mr. Minicucci?
Yes, Madam Chair, will do. And let me go ahead and share. I'll share real quickly the council one. Yep, here in a second. There you go. I'll be right there. There it is. So, Madam Chair, this is the City Council's federal legislative agenda. Basically, it's developed to be succinct. The councilors, when we approached them, we notified them, we gave them guidance as to what seemed to fit best into the federal congressional designated investment process, or the earmark process. And that was that the congressional delegations for the last several years here in New Mexico were focusing on public safety, for housing and social services or behavioral health. And also they seemed at times open to special projects that would benefit an area. For that reason, we kind of recommended that, you stay within that we kind of keep within those boundaries to assure funding. Also, to remember that these projects have to go through a federal grant compliance process. So the ability of the city to manage the project and keep it on track to receive funding timely and to get the funding out. And so the councilors were, what they focused on were basically those categories. They did a total from all the districts of 19 projects. The one that seemed to, of course, received the most support was the renovate and expand the Albuquerque Regional Shooting Range Park. The reason for that is not only is there a need for that park, but that it fits well within the federal funding scenario, basically because both the city, state, and federal government enforcement agencies use the park for firearms training. In addition, the park is on BLM land that was deeded to the city with a covenant that it has to be used for regional, that we have to continue to maintain it in good shape for recreational purposes. In this case, the regional shooting range, to keep the project within the city's title. If not, we have to revert back to the BLM. So it felt like a good project that would benefit the cities, the federal government, as well as with the city. So a number of councilors you see Councilors Councilor Sanchez, Councilors Bassan, Councilors Lewis, Councilors Champagne, and Councilors Grout have requested funding with this. Then the other ones, again, they follow that formula of public housing, special projects such as the visitor center, the Route 66 celebration, but also public safety, social services, and all the rest of the dot projects pretty much follow that scenario for a total of 19. We do know that under our new ordinance for the IGR, that we went from being priorities to requests within a program, which means it's kind of open to put in as much as needs as there are. However, again, our recommendation from staff to the council at the time was that because of the way the delegation selects their projects, that would be best to stay within these focus areas. And with that, we're also using the same kind of format for presentation that Mr. Parkinson developed last year for the city's combined process, as you can see that here. So with that, I will stand for any questions. Or I guess both myself and Mr. Parkinson.
Thank you, Mr. Manicucci. Any questions or discussion from members on these? I guess I would like to ask Mr. O'Donnell and Mr. Pagonis, based upon what you've seen here, does this meet with what you all have asked of us in terms of thinking both about timeliness and in terms of clarity on what we are putting forward related to our federal priorities? You're on mute, Mr. O'Donnell.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, I think it does. There are a lot of moving parts to a federal program like this when you have the administration and the council having projects that they want to advance. But in talking with Mr. Parkinson and Mr. Manicucci today, following the conversation, I thought back about what we've done the past few years. And frankly, I think the approach that we've used in engaging with the delegation, identifying the projects, both the city thinks are important and that the delegation thinks they can fund or fit within the program areas of interest that they have, I think this process will still work. I think that what we've done over the past 3 years for sure is that Mr. Pagonis and myself have reviewed the list of projects and said there are these that lend themselves to probably competitive earmarks, and there are others that are probably better as grant applications because of the amount of money, the scope of the program. And then when you look at what members request in their outline, their questionnaire that you respond to, for example, Congressman Stansberry had 30 questions in her appropriations form that you would have to complete. And some of that really addresses things like the readiness of a project for the money to be spent. It also says, is there a federal program account that relates to this specific project of interest? So there are several layers of filtering that the requests go through. And then it comes down to, you may wind up with, I'm just going to pick a number, you may wind up with 12 projects that are a combination of city council and administration that look like they're pretty competitive. Those get submitted, and as Mr. Menacucci and Mr. Parkinson know, the delegation comes back sometimes and says, we see this list of projects, but there's one on here that we don't see that we think would be very attractive to us, and we think we could probably find funding for. And so it gets added into this in a very informal way. So I think that we can work with the format and the approach that you've outlined here.
Thank you, Mr. O'Donnell. Councillor Bassan?
Madam Chair, I am still reviewing a little bit on them, but I personally think it seems a little confusing to say legislative programs. I thought legislative requests is more about policy and programs is more about capital. So I don't know if that is just me. But at the same time, I definitely, when I see, particularly on the council one, I need to look at the admin's one, but the title on it says legislative program requests. And so as I start reading through it, I'm thinking it's going to be more about what legislative policies we're asking the federal delegation. And I'm looking at it thinking, well, gosh, these are all capital requests. They're program requests. So I don't know if it's all, that's the lingo in Washington or not.
Or Madam Chair, I think that's I think a correction you found. We had just probably were in the original development of the title. We're looking at both legislative requests and capital, and we didn't get any legislative requests, so we didn't go back to correct the title. So I think that's a correction we can make in the document, and that does need to be corrected.
Madam Chair?
Yes, Mr. O'Donnell.
Councillor Bassan raises a good point, and I'd just like to say a couple of things about legislative versus project. So we traditionally have not had a legislative request, and that is, let's say, for example, I mentioned the Water Resources Development Act, which is a Corps of Engineers bill, and it does have implications for the city of Albuquerque. But the city did not take a position on the WRDA legislation. And I would say, especially since earmarking has come back, the city has not had a list of specific federal legislative issues, either existing legislation or legislation the city thinks ought to be introduced. We always mention legislation because it's one of those options to be included if there's a priority. Related to that, we've mentioned each year about this time that there are earmarks for projects, and when Congress wasn't doing earmarks for projects, members in the House and the Senate found another way to sort of make a connection with constituents, and it was called programmatic request, programmatic earmark requests, which are if the city felt strongly about CDBG funding, the Community Development Block Grant, and thought that $3.2 billion was not enough for the program, the city could, and there's a process for this in the appropriations process that the House and Senate have, where you can make a programmatic request. So you could make a programmatic request to, up the funding for CDBG to 3.7 billion. So I say this because Councilor Bassan makes a point about the term legislative, and we typically have not had real legislative priorities. I will say this, over the years, what I've really seen happen is you will see the National League of Cities or the U.S. Conference of Mayors contact somebody in the mayor's office, or if there's a city councilor who's particularly active with NLC, and they'll say, you really need to write a letter to your congressional delegation about the status of the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, WIOA, which is the Workforce Development Boards. And that's probably the way most of the legislative initiatives would get raised and addressed. It's not something that the city really has been prospective about in developing the legislative program. It really comes up during the legislative year when legislation which is relevant to the city or its interests may come to our attention, and either NLC or the U.S. Conference of Mayors or ourselves get in touch with you and say, we need a letter from the mayor, or the council member who's really interested in this ought to write a letter to the congressional delegation about it. I say this because it's one way I want to make sure that we flag this and make it known that those opportunities exist and we should take advantage of them when they do.
Thanks, Ms. I want to make sure that actually, Councilor Bassan, I think you have a specific question about the wording, and I just want to make sure we have your direction that you're asking.
Madam Chair, I just looked, I even with what I'm reviewing on the admin's paper, it seems like they're capital. And to me, I've always differentiated capital and legislative. And I don't, thank you for the description, Mr. O'Donnell. I did get kind of lost. But at the same time, it seems like most of these requests are capital. Mm-hmm. So rather than say policy support, like what in legislative support, why don't we say capital or whatever term and word? Because even on the admin's one, it says, and I'm not looking at it right this second, but it says legislative policy, capital, program, support, and so to me, it just seems like we could make it clearer. But if it's not the will of the committee and I'm the only one that sees it that way, then I'm willing to take that one as well.
Thank you, Councilor Bassan. I did just ask for a little bit of clarification from our team. The title on ours is specifically to ensure that we were addressing the resolution as it was passed by council, so that we were, directly responsive to the expectation of an EC that sent down from the administration. And so, I think from our perspective, being inclusive of options, I see what your point is on, I'm only speaking to this one, obviously, is that in some cases, we do want to think about, for instance, on the back page, it talks about economic development and workforce training. So that would be programmatic support that we would potentially be seeking. So I do think there is a little bit of a mixture, and it would be something that potentially from a policy standpoint, we would be interested in any sort of policy change that would occur at the federal level to allow for additional support at the local level for the programs that are within many of these capital requests that you see here. So for example, Medicaid changes that might be made available, from a policy perspective to improve our Medicaid reimbursement related to individuals that are in treatment and seeking and needing supportive housing. So I think we are feeling that we want to be as broad as possible from that perspective, but also don't want to be confusing, obviously, for any of our federal delegation.
Madam Chair, the fact that you have a couple things in there, even if it's just a couple, it counts. I mean, it counts to me that there's policy. So I think that absolutely makes more sense. I just, and I certainly am not wanting to dictate to, you know, the admin side of what title you want on there. I do want to defer to the other counselors on the committee if they want the council side of it to read legislative program policies or something like that. Because to me, that everything on the list for council is capital. There's nothing on that list that I saw that I could be wrong, but from what I saw, it seems like it's all capital. There's nothing policy related as far as legislation.
I was just going to ask Mr. Minicucci if he could put up the council's version. And then, of course, defer to Councilor Pena, Councilor Grout, as you all, if you all have any discussion you want in terms of change.
Madam Chair, I would just say that it would be, I think we should just have both titles be the same. So we can just add what you have on yours. And this way, that'll be the title going forward. And there's not confusion in future years about whether that's the place to put policy, and even though perhaps policy in our current request.
Madam Chair, I would concur with that. I think they should be the same titles.
Great, thank you. Mr. Minicucci, I assume that's a edit amendment you could make to this, and we could make a motion to send this without rec to the council with that amendment to the title of the city council document.
Okay. Yeah, so Madam Chair, it would basically be, the amendment would be that the city council document title would read 2025 Albuquerque City Council Federal Legislative Policy and Capital Program Requests. Would that be consistent?
Yes, Mr. Minicucci, that would match. Thank you. Any other discussion before we keep going? Councilor Grout?
I would second that.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, guys.
That's quite all right. Any other discussion from the members? Councilor Pena, I'm just checking because I can see you're off mute. I just don't want to cut you off. And no, you're fine to stay off mute. I just didn't want to cut you off if you had something. Great. Then all those in favor signify by raising your hand, and aye. Aye. Any opposed? Great. Thank you. I think that wraps up this item. I recognize that this will be go forward from the committee to council without. Thank you all. I think that we were very efficient this version as in comparison to last. I knew it took us a bit to work through this, and again, I just want to acknowledge and thank Councilor Pena, and I think Councilor Grout and Bassan worked with her on reworking some of the resolutions at City Council, and I think we have a clearer process. So thank you. And Councilor Bassan?
Madam Chair, I just wanted to know, should we try to do this with immediate action if the council will do that when it comes before us?
Thank you, Councilor Bassan. I think based upon Mr. O'Donnell's feedback in the past, he's best served to have it as soon as possible approved so that they can begin their work. And I think if it pleases the committee, I would appreciate if we could send it for immediate action.
I would second that.
Thank you. Yes. Mr. Anderson, sorry, I forget you needed to speak. I apologize.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Councilor Bassan on that point. And Mr. Minicucci, I know there's been a few versions of these. If I'm remembering correctly, I think the resolution or the ordinance actually says shall be voted on at the city council meeting following the IGR that these are approved. So I think we're kind of locked into that no matter what, Councilor Bassan.
Okay, that's good to be reminded of. I just wasn't sure because typically it's always we report it out of committee and then, but I think that sounds great.
Thank you. Thank you for remembering that, Mr. Anderson. So we have a motion in a second. I guess we will vote on it even though it is in the resolution or in the ordinance, but all those in favor with aye, raise your hand. Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Thank you, everyone. Great. The last item on our agenda is other business. Is there any other business of any member or staff that we need to have before us today?
Madam Chair, just as notification that starting next in January, the IGR in late January will start to go towards more frequent meetings as it goes through the legislative session. The meetings are scheduled in during the week. Though, just as a reminder, Mr. Thompson did mention that, and I don't know if he's still with us, but he did indicate that there might be some kind of need for Saturday meetings. And so if that happens because of our public ordinance or our public notification ordinance, we'd have to know if we're going to change to a Saturday meeting, probably within a 2-week period. So I don't know if that's, and usually those Saturday meetings would happen in the latter date of the 60-day session. So at the next meeting, I guess we could hear from Mr. Thompson if that's necessary. And that at that point in time, this committee, if it would want to meet on Saturdays in the latter part of the session, they would probably want to make that adjustment at the next January meeting, just as an FYI.
Thank you, Mr. Minicucci. I do believe that there has been some discussion amongst members and staff was whether or not we want to maintain that previous standard of the more frequent meetings and what makes sense as in terms of official IGR meetings versus staff meeting with lobbyists or lobbyists providing us with written reports or oral reports to staff that then we receive. I just wanted to open it up to the committee members regarding that discussion as to how folks are feeling about that idea. My understanding, Mr. Minicucci, is that we had it once a week, and then there were times when we went to twice a week. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, during the Saturday sessions, it was just during once a week. Last year, when we started to compound the meetings, we had them set up for twice a week as we finished up the session. But in the Saturdays was always once a week, though. I mean, that could still, if the nature of the session and the city's interaction on legislation is such that twice a week is required, that could be set up.
So I just wanted to ask the other members what your perspective is in terms of weekly meetings, or if we would prefer staff to be meeting weekly and receiving a report out. And we could obviously adjust that later as well for us to meet.
Madam, go ahead.
Yes,
ahead.
Councilor Pena? Oh,
I'll go for Councilor Grout. I think she was going for.
Councilor Grout, you're on mute, and
You,
now
I know it's difficult, like if we had an emergency meeting that we needed to have, and it's not we haven't notified the public, then we're in a pickle. So I would vote to have those meetings scheduled, and then we can always receive those texts easily, and then it can be canceled if necessary. But seems to be it's harder if I just don't want to get into pickle.
Thank you, Councilor Grout. Councilor Pena?
So thank you, Madam Chair. I was going to say similar to what Councilor Grout said. I think we keep the meetings on the books just so that we can be flexible and be able to respond if there's any need. But I think we should do a dual process, is to where really for some other items, the staff should be able to communicate with our lobbyists, and then they should be able to report out whatever is happening. And we can make that determination at that time whether we need a meeting, and they're already on the books. So, because I did feel like we were getting a little, the meetings were getting a little bit cumbersome in terms of, just having to have it on the books every week. So, I would that would be my recommendation, is that they're on the books. We don't necessarily need to meet. If the lobbyists can communicate with our staff, they can report out to us. But if there is something absolutely of importance that we need to act on, then we would have that meeting.
Great, thank you, Councilor Pena.
So, Madam Chair, at the next meeting, I can present the 2025 scheduled meetings for adoption by the committee. What we could do is we could have the meetings when we get to once a week. We could have, like you said, twice a week, once in the middle of the week and once on Saturday. But they're just there. And then if the meetings need to happen, the staff, they can just do the lobby staff can report to staff But if some bill is going through, like Mr. Thompson said, that threatens the autonomy of the city, those meetings would be there and ready for the committee to meet if necessary. Is that something that's a document I could bring forward next meeting if you would like? Agenda.
Thank you, Ms. Cucci. That sounds like a perfect solution for us to consider at the next meeting. And in what I'm hearing is that it is acceptable for us to imagine two meetings per week scheduled, one of those being on the Saturday to accommodate our lobbyists' needs, as which thank goodness that they're going to be busy during the week. That's exactly what we want them to be. And we'll look at that at the next meeting and adopt a schedule so that you all can publicly post those. Thank you, Mr. Minicucci, for doing that. Is there any other business that we need to discuss? Hearing nothing, thank you all very much. We're adjourned. Have a great day. Thanks for your time.